So good morning. I'd like to thank UWC for the invitation to participate in this stimulating meeting around the theme Fragmentation and Form. I want to especially thank Jane Taylor for recommending my name as a lecturer here today. By reading the concept note for this meeting, I was interested, above all, in the possibility of talking about the complementary relationship between form and fragment in the archives of the digital era, especially in the post-internet era, and even more specifically in social networks. I'll talk about a specific interface design invention called infinite scroll, which features as the main mode of interaction in platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. I will focus more specifically on examining the use of this invention in Facebook, which, since its emergence in 2004, is still a dominant platform, even if today one can already see signs of its exhaustion. By historicizing and analyzing the infinite scroll, I intend to show. Oh, now you're good. I intend to show that this visual field, while presenting events stacked in a supposedly chronological way, is, however, composed of interchangeable fragments. On this historical path, I will choose Jacques Derrida's thinking as my intercessor, interweaving my narrative with experts from his seminal book, Archive Fever. The choice of Derrida is not only due to thematic affinity, it is also due to the fact that the philosopher himself was notoriously interested at various moments of his work in the development of digital technologies. In 2001, in an introductory text for the book Paper Machine, Derrida wondered, what becomes of the archive when the world of paper is subordinated to all these new machines for virtualization? Is there such a thing as a virtual event, a virtual archive? Would that be new? Another archive fever? And wonder where the digital technology scenario was another archive fever. Derrida was cautious, it seems to me, to make statements about the novelty brought by the internet. When he wondered if there was something new, another archive fever, perhaps he was sensing a new archival scene, different from the one he plunged into when he wrote Archive Fever. I do not intend here to make Derrida's thoughts the center of this presentation, nor to interrogate how prophetic his theses were. I'd rather, in a fragmentary and tentative way, gather some of his reflections, themselves also fragmentary and resistant to reductions, in order to explore possible implications of what he calls machines of virtualization, on the ways the archive is made visible today through its interfaces, which is through its design. My research on the history of social media, which I began to develop in 2018 as a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University, at its beginning aroused my curiosity regarding the displacement of the use of the word post with the advent of social media. As it turned out, post has gradually ceased to refer to epistolary communication and gave way to the meaning attached to the act of posting an announcement, communication, or notice online. In English language dictionaries, the connection between post and online publishing was first found in the early years of this century. It was in its 10th edition of 2003 that Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary inserted a new sense of post as to publish as a message something in an online forum, as an electronic bulletin board. In this definition, I would like to draw attention to the term bulletin board, which obviously existed well before its electronic form. A historical look back to the 1970s shows a special moment when the bulletin board starts to turn into the electronic bulletin board. The pioneering electronic board was a platform called Community Memory, which has been retrospectively identified as the seed of social media by one of its creators, the electronic engineer Lee Felsenstein. This system was born around 1973 in the city of Berkeley, California, in the wake of the countercultural movements of 1960s, which marked the struggle for civil rights on and off the University of California campus. Influenced by the free speech movement, Lee Felsenstein developed the interest in exploring the computational means for many-to-many communication as an alternative to the centralization of traditional media. Technically, the first version of community memory consisted of a teletype connected to a modem that, by means of a single phone call per day, allowed users to enter and access information stored on a remote server. The machine printed on paper, in addition to instructions for its use, messages filtered by keywords such as music, politics, housing, services, feminism, and technology. The system's first terminal was installed in a popular record store in front of a board where hundreds of ads were posted, as can be seen in this curious photograph of 1975. The conventional bulletin board, full of messages, is ignored by two men who are amused by the electronic novelty. The teletype is not visible, covered by a cardboard shelter that, as much as it conceals the visual reality, keyboard, punch, tape, and printer, it also intends to muffle the auditory. Felsenstein reports that, quote, the teletype motor and the chunk of the printhead were unpleasantly loud, unquote. I was not sure how that noisy machine would be accepted by a public engaged in counterculture, but the device turned out to be a huge success. The use of the new electronic messaging system quickly overtook the old one. Thus, as Felsenstein recounts, quote, all the musicians' bulletin board traffic transferred to this better technology, unquote. It is at this point, the very moment it becomes electronic, that the bulletin board begins to take on the contours of an archival system. The paper message repository of the physical bulletin board was not intended as an archive, since the messages, even though they could eventually be stored, were in principle short-lived. In other words, this system was intended for community, but not so much for the purposes of memory. It is only when the messages migrate to the computer system and gain the name of community memory that the fragmentation of the multiple messages on paper gains some order. They begin to acquire an indexation and a database capable of recording the date and time of their insertion. Moreover, this order is also reflected in the output, a strip of paper with printed messages which correspond exactly to the user's demand. Archiving on the mainstream computer combined with this output made it possible to record and to extract, giving the bulletin board a fundamental archival condition that is its exteriority. One archive, says Derrida, will never be either memory or anamnesis as spontaneous, alive, and internal experience. On the contrary, the archive takes place at the place of originary and structural breakdown of the said memory. There is no archive without a place of consignation, without a certain exteriority, no archive without outside. A series of publicity brochures of community memory allows us to trace at the level of discourse, approximations, and distinctions with this exteriority dimension of the archive. This presentation text leaves no doubt that besides being a communicative system, it does not ignore its potential as an archive. And now there's a detail. Yes. Community memory can help people get in touch with one another. We hope that community memory will become an important archive of community history. The same text also makes a point of making explicit the outer place where things are kept as a location with an address. The computer terminal is part of the community memory system. This terminal and two other terminals are connected to a computer located in a warehouse in West Berkeley. The computer is programmed to store messages that people type in at those terminals. This exteriority also expressed the dream for a horizontal, anonymous, decentralized form of communication that could combat the dominant media. Mass communications media tell everybody what a few people have to say. The purpose of community memory is to support the direct and unmediated exchange of information among individuals and groups. In these passages, we see an important distancing from the conceptual weave with which Derrida presents us the archive. That is, the archon, the authority, the owner of the house where the archive is located. He writes, the meaning of archive, its only meaning, comes to it from the Greek archaion, initially a house, a domicile, an address, the residence of superior magistrates, the archons, those who commanded. The citizens who thus held and signified political power were considered to possess the right to make or to represent the law. In principle, the community memory system advertises itself and is configured as an archive. But the unequivocal ideological position in defense of unmediated communication does not match the archival condition of being domiciled in the homes of members of a privileged class like that of those archons. Community memory aimed to attack a centralizing power in which a few could, quote, tell everybody what a few people have to say. It was a utopian belief that technology could, by taking charge of managing the exchange of messages, establish a neutral system of recording and retrieving archival material in which there would be, as they say, proudly announced, no mediating between people and information. At the next stop on this history, the figure of an archon begins to timidly insinuate itself with the BBSs, that is, the bulletin board systems. The first personal computers were initially sold as assembly kits and primarily purchased by hobbyists. These computers made it possible for ordinary individuals to bring network management into the domestic space. With the emergence of the first public BBS in 1974, anyone who purchased a computer and administration software could create a system and become a SISOP, or system operator. The SISOP made his personal phone line available to users who could, by login, post ads, exchange messages, play games, and in some cases participate in computer-based discussion forums. The advent of SISOP brought the novelty that a single individual took over the role of controlling and archiving message and other contents of the system on floppy disks in his or her home. These were ordinary people who did not have the status of a magistrate or of a hermeneutic, able to speak the law as Derrida pointed out. Yet they held a good deal of power. According to a site devoted to keep alive the history of the activities of the BBSs, due to the hobbyist nature of the network, any privacy between sender and recipient was only the result of politeness from the owners of the systems involved in the mail's transfer. It was common, however, for systems operators to reserve the right to review the content of the mail that passed through their system. In terms of interface, the typical BBS interaction consisted of typing the initial letter of command in the main menu. New information will appear on the screen, automatically pushing up what had been previously written. With this potentially perpetual motion, the finite form of the paper strip gives way to a certain perception of infinity, and the certain idea of streaming begins. But the integrity of the temporal continuity of information retrieval has not been shaken, and thus a formal unity is still maintained. Despite its tactile immateriality, the textual structure, arranged vertically in a continuous form, was still dominant form of message consumption, despite the fact that the messages now followed each other on a monitor and no longer on a paper strip. With the arrival of the internet, the common public in the early 1990s, having for years been the privilege of government agencies and universities, the BBS has practically disappeared. This brought important consequences for two archival structural aspects. Regarding the category of the owner, or the archon in Derrida's terms, many of the old size-ups became owners of internet service providers, moving away from direct contact with users. This was when corporate services like American Online emerged and became visible, the visible side of power over information. And this transition, both the identity of the archive keeper and the exact location where information is kept were gradually made invisible. In previous systems, even if one didn't know exactly where information was stored, it was possible to at least imagine this location. In the case of the community memory, it was a mainframe computer located somewhere in West Berkeley. In the case of the BBSs, the floppy disks stored in the home of some size-up. In terms of the BBS's interface, as I have shown, the updating of the visual field was entirely commanded by a single movement, the scroll. With the internet, this field gains new possibilities with the institution of a new dominant interactive mode, the clicking on links. Yeah, it's just a little flow of clicking. No, I'm just giving time for the mouse pointer to click. Now, from any given point on the screen, a mouse click could instantly update and change the whole visual field. A combination of the internet and hyperlinks finally broke the unity of the linear reading sequence experienced with scrolling. From then on, the hyperlink became the symbolic image of an open, nonlinear, and decentralized informational space. Here, the randomness of the fragments of papers attached to the physical bulletin board seems to return like a flash of optimism. Multiple informational modules present themselves not in a strip of sequential information, but in a city of independent sites, seemingly without the figure of a controlling authority. Seemingly, of course. The sense of aggregation or domicile of the archive is also dispersed, which is reflected in the very interaction by hyperlinks. One no longer perceives a single address for the archive, but many addresses, and the entrance to each of these comes through words highlighted in a textual field. In other words, the configuration of visual fields reflects the very culture of multiple sites, as opposed to the individual home. However, despite the promises of a greater democratization of information in the next step of this history, the visual field will undergo yet a new transformation and will again be configured into a formal unit, this time not at all democratic. I will show this transition through the story of the Iranian-Canadian blogger and activist Hossein Derakhshan. Derakhshan became famous for pioneering blog culture, for his political activism, and for his pedagogical work in teaching other people how to make blogs. Accused of anti-government propaganda, he was arrested at his home in Tehran in 2008. As a consequence, he was deprived of internet access for 6 years until he was released in 2014. Because he was in confinement during the years when social media rose to its now dominant position, his account on the shift from hyperlink to social media structures condenses a historical mutation that took 6 years to happen. The hyperlink represented, this is him, the hyperlink represented the open, interconnected spirit of the World Wide Web. The hyperlink was a way to abandon centralization, all the links, lines, and hierarchies, and replace them with something more distributed, a system of nodes and networks. Their action opposes the system of nodes and networks to a linear display system in continuous flow that he identifies as streaming. He says, today, the stream is digital media's dominant form of organizing information. It's in every social network and mobile application. The prominence of the stream today means a deep betrayal to the diversity that the World Wide Web had originally envisioned. The stream would correspond to the passive consumption of social media platforms that are invested in ensuring that the user does not leave the space of the interface. Their action laments. When I log on to Facebook, all I need to do is to scroll. I occasionally click on the like or share button, read people's comments or leave one, or open an article, but I remain inside Facebook, and it continues to broadcast what I might like. The words with which their action describes the importance of hyperlinks sort of resurrects on the internet the visionary enthusiasm with a centerless communication typical of the counterculture that inspired community memory. Then, with his frustration upon leaving jail, he shows us that the freedom embedded in the fragmentation of navigating by hyperlinks was gradually returning to the monotony of scrolling. We can understand behind this concept of stream and the words, I remain inside Facebook, an interactive experience with the same visual field of sliding up or down. This visual field is called infinite scroll. The infinite scroll appeared around the year 2006 as a solution to a design problem detected in the kind of next and previous type of navigation. This was one of the first and most elementary forms of browsing since the beginning of the World Wide Web. It was typical of search engines such as Yahoo and Google. These screens presented the user with a large number of occurrences found for a given search by means of pages containing a limited list of links. At the end of this list, numbers indicated the division into sections of the total amount of items found. For the self-proclaimed inventor of the infinite scroll, engineer Asa Haskin, this kind of interaction was disruptive and distracting. To eliminate the need to click for more, he developed a system in which content was displayed only vertically. As the user scrolls a certain number of times, reaching the limit that the system admits, new elements are loaded into memory and displayed without the page having to be entirely refreshed. Depending on the connection speed, this loading becomes practically imperceptible to the user, who has the illusion that she is in fact scrolling through a non-sectioned hole. In other words, this user experiences a continuous stream that reaches her as a temporal sequence of events. The association between the linearity of infinite scroll with temporal order can be perceived in successive changes in the Facebook interface. Already in 2006, the visual and interactive field called Newsfeed was introduced as a list in which posts begin to be ordered vertically according to a reverse chronological order from newest to oldest. The sense of archive, which had been weakened by the dispersion of hyperlinks, gains new strength by this apparently temporal stability. But besides this formal aspect, the sense of the archive is also reinforced symbolically. In 2011, Facebook introduced a new visual field, This field was designed for the area of the user's personal profile, and it was named Timeline. And the first post that was given by default when someone created a profile on Facebook showed their date of birth accompanied by the image of a baby. Thus, the posts on a timeline aligns themselves with memorable events in our own lives, starting with our own birth. However, the relationship between the integrity of its visual vertical form and temporal sequence is in fact illusory. This is due to the very algorithmic constitution of the infinite scroll. Rather than a continuous string, it is actually composed and recomposed at each axis. The blocks of fragments that compose this form are interchangeable, consisting a kind of archive in which the elements are not always there in the temporal position where we think we have placed them. Here is an example of a series of experiments I did by accessing at different times and days my own and other people's news feeds. The white dashed lines divides before and after accesses on different days, while the non-red areas correspond to items that have been modified. In the detail, we can see that in the second axis, an advertisement has been replaced by a post that was hidden on the first axis. I have noticed that posts are rearranged, omitted, or even replaced by new ones. Therefore, this terrain, which seems to us to have a certain totality and stability with respect to the archived events, is in fact an unstable field, subject to change every time we access Facebook. In other words, a curatorship of the past takes place. In this long, but here abbreviated, historical trajectory between the bulletin board and the electronic bulletin board of social media, we notice an oscillation between dispersion and unity, fragmentation and form. Throughout this story of the infinite scroll, we have seen that a formal unity gets to coexist with a fragmented structure. For the physical bulletin board to the infinite scroll, the story unfolds as if the countless pieces of paper acquired at the same time a unity and a new kind of fragmentation. It is this fragmentation that allows this apparently uniform field to present us with a new past, even if we think we are accessing the same archive. I return now to Derrida. What is no longer archived in the same way is no longer lived in the same way. Archivable meaning is also and in advance co-determined by the structure that archives. This maxim allows us in a very simple manner to ask, in what way the archivable meaning, that is, our own understanding of the archive and of the relations we establish with it, allows itself to be co-determined by the archival structure visible in the interface of the infinite scroll. I would like to propose some reflections around this question by revisiting yet another excerpt from Archive Fever, in which Derrida elaborates on the relation that Freud makes between the topologies he proposed for the human psychic apparatus and a device named the Wunderburg, translated into English as the mystic writing pad. This object, still on the market as a children's toy, consists basically of a rectangular waxed pad on which there is a sheet of waxed paper protected by another layer of transparent celluloid. By writing on the celluloid, strokes are initially visible on the surface, but by simply lifting and peeling the celluloid surface from the base, the writing disappears, leaving nonetheless traces imprinted on the wax base. Freud sees in this device a similarity with his topological proposition to explain the functioning of what he named Perception Consciousness System, the PCPTCS. In this system, stimuli would be as if written and temporarily present to consciousness, but would soon fade away, leaving their mark on the unconscious layer adjacent to it. Let us read this passage carefully. The pad provides not only a receptive surface that can be used over and over again, like a slate, but also permanent traces of what has been written, like an ordinary paper pad. It solves the problem of combining the two functions by dividing them between two separate but interrelated component parts or systems. But this is precisely the way in which our mental apparatus performs its perceptual function. The layer which receives the stimuli forms no permanent traces. The foundations of memory come about in other adjoining systems. It is clear that for Freud, this technical object serves only to represent outwardly what an inner instance. That is, it is an analogy of the human psychic apparatus. Exterior and interior are kept in each own place. This is what interests me here more than the theory itself. Is that this is an analogy between a technical object and a certain proposal topology for the psychic function and memory. So if changing the object, we now try to find points of contact between the infinite scroll and the Freudian categories. Does this boundary so sharply drawn between exterior and interior still stand? Do these categories maintain a purely analogical relation? The writing surface of the wax base, or the wax base, was consistent with the absence of chronological organization typical of the unconscious, and accordingly was not retrievable by an effort of voluntary memory. In this sense, the analogy is closer to the chaotic fragmentation of the paper bulletin board than to the uniformity of the infinite scroll. But Facebook's interface also bears some resemblance to the way Freud conceived the unconscious. Firstly, this archival structure does not, as I have shown, behave as an exclusively supplementary way, but it seems to have a life of its own, rearranging the past with subtractions and substitutions of posts in a seemingly intact field. In the community memories and in the BBS's interface, the output resulted in a list always based on the user's request. Unlike that, in Facebook's interface, what appears to us results not from a query, but from an invisible curatorship established by some unknown outcome. Secondly, the disappearance of unexpected fragments to consciousness is emphasized by yet another related feature. This is the suggestion of memories through the presentation of photos from the past, which surprises us, usually when we access Facebook for the first time in the morning. This involuntary memory, to use Marcel Proust's famous term, expresses a relationship between the external mnemonic supplement and the unexpected emergence of memory fragments. Would this device come to behave outwardly as a certain kind of occurrence? Facebook's interface goes even further in attempting to create a never-increasing intimacy between the external archival system and our own subjectivity. As in other social media, there is the explicit and constant encouragement that we share intimate moments, personal opinions, and emotions. On Facebook, from 2009 until today, at the top of the infinite scroll, we received this invitation: what's on your mind? This is an invitation to an inner dialogue that is made by an outer field, which presents itself as a support, not only for memories, but also for our own thinking. The posts then also behave as expressions of the consciousness that the user leaves stored as in a diary. Today's infinite scroll comes from a long series of technological interactions in which, as Derrida anticipated as early as in 1966, the machine in the world has at least begun to resemble memory and increasingly resembles it more closely. its resemblance to memory is closer than that of the innocent mystic pet, which, compared to other machines for storing archives, it's a child's toy. I have pointed out here some ways in which this interactive design invention called infinite scroll expresses this growing resemblance with inner memory. Now I would like to make the reverse question, that is, how our memory and psyche may itself be becoming more and more similarly shaped to the technical apparatus, blurring the very distinction between what we name inner and outer, breaking the analogical relation. Because the intimate contents we post coexist with contents from the outside, Facebook's infinite scroll also behaves like the perceptual layer of consciousness, attentive to events in the world. Just as we receive impulses coming from within, such as the old photos suggested by the interface, we also see in the same visual field external stimuli, such as advertisements, news, and the most varied suggestions. The infinite scroll's action in reordering the past, therefore, does not only impact an interiority, a personal perception of the archive, but it also affects the events experienced in community. At least since the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2018, it has become public that personal data from Facebook have been used to create profile types for targeted advertising. We know today how much reordering of the archive is algorithmically determined to reinforce certain views and to condition our consumption not only of products, but also of political platforms and ideological stances. This targeting, as has become public, can decide elections, as was the case of Donald Trump in the United States and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. After being elected, Bolsonaro, as well as his sons, used social media to manipulate public opinion on various issues. Some examples are the campaigns against vaccination for COVID-19 and for the purpose of ineffective drugs for the disease, the propagation of racist and homophobic messages, and the threats to the Brazilian Supreme Court and democracy. But Bolsonaro does not express these denialist, racist, and then anti-democratic stances only through posts in social media. He also propagates them live or through other media. Once elected, Bolsonaro has made the reconstruction of the past a way to publicly addressing himself, not caring if his lies are disproven. Here are just two examples of what's become a pattern. In 2014, he stated in a videotaped interview, between a man and a young woman, what does the businessman think? She's going to get pregnant soon. 6 months maternity leave. Who is going to pay the bill? That's why the guy pays less for the woman. This was very weird coming from my mouth, because I don't even look at Bolsonaro's images as I can, but here it's important. Sure. So in 2018, he stated, find me an audio, an image of me saying that women have to earn less than men. It doesn't exist. On another occasion, the correction came more quickly. On a visit to the Brazilian state of Maranhão, whose governor was his political opponent, when he was offered a pink soft drink, typical of that region, he declared, now I've become a faggot, just like someone from Maranhão, is that it? And the next day, he apologized to those offended for what he considered to have been a joke. If anyone was offended, I'm sorry. I made a joke about the soft drink's color, which is pink. One thing is common in both episodes. On both occasions, the first one, when he denied what he had said, and the second, when saying it was a joke, Bolsonaro acted as if their archive had no power to hold him accountable. Either he never said it, or he never meant it seriously. What occurs in his lives is the strengthening of an idea that even if something is archived, it doesn't matter because the past can be instantly reviewed according to political needs of the moment. Bolsonaro is not an individual force. Despite his current obvious political decline, he still maintains about 30% of voting intentions and supporters in Brazil. This means approximately 63 million people. In the social networks, his denialist behavior, which disregards any commitment to truth, is imitated and propagated. Even if disproved, people continue to lie, rephrasing their sentences. This operation that presupposes and institutes the reordering and curatorship of events, at least in the Brazilian case, can also be seen as a behavioral practice that echoes the operation of the interface analyzed here. In exactly the same way as the update of the infinite scrolls visual field, an update that changes the block of information presented, Boschendal and his followers express a practice and an understanding of the archive, in which the archived content is held to be easily manageable. Returning now one last time to Freud and the mystic path in Derrida, Derrida says, it is at least possible to ask whether the structure of the psychic apparatus, which Freud sought to describe with the mystic path, resists the evolution of archival technoscience or not. Is the psychic apparatus better represented, or is it affected differently by all the technical mechanisms for archivization and for reproduction of so-called live memory, for simulacrums of living things which are already and will increasingly be more refined, complicated, powerful than the mystic path, microcomputing, electronization, computerization, etc. Following Derrida, we can ask, could the form of the infinite scroll, consisting of fragments ordered and rearranged with each axis, be not only representing, but also affecting both the very concept of archive and, who knows, the psychic structure itself? To what extent might the history of a visual field that oscillates between form and fragment, dispersion and unity, interiority and exteriority, let us glimpse a new kind of archive? Will this structure of external curatorship of memory be able to defeat and replace previous technical models where once fragmentation meant freedom and form accurate credibility? Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could think a little bit about what time does to the fragment. The time of scrolling, the repetition of scrolling, the return to Facebook on sometimes, if we're distracted on a minute-by-minute basis, and to think about the question we raised yesterday about slow reading, about close reading, and what's happened to the interiority of that through the fragmentation of these habits, because they have become habits that are very, very hard to break. People now take, holidays from Facebook and that sort of thing to try and stabilize their mind, to try and calm down their thinking. So I'm just wondering if you could think a little bit about this question of the consequences of this for reading in the way we brought it up yesterday.
Thank you very much, Marcos. I thought that was extremely provocative. I wanted to ask a question that ties into Lydia Liu's wonderful book called The Freudian Robot. And she's trying to think similarly to the work that you've presented to us, the kind of interconnections and intersections of the psychic structure and technology. So the topography of the psychic structure and technology, and what she brings to bear on the problem beyond Freud is Norbert Wiener's inquiry into cybernetics and communication and control in the late 1940s that resulted in the subsequent publication, The Human Use of Human Beings, in which he is faced with great trepidation about the future of a kind of overwhelming speed and colonization of the psychic structure by the machine. And she invokes a famous Japanese robotics scholar, Masahiro Mori, and since Jane is moderating this panel, I thought this is an appropriate question, because what Masahiro Mori does is to produce the puppet, the Bonraku puppet tradition, as an antidote to the slide into the uncanny valley. And I wondered if you could think with us a little bit about antidotes to the kind of constrictions of space and speed that someone like Paul Virilio has warned us about in his information bomb, and more recently in the administration of fear, a text that is terrifying about the kind of prospect of a psychic structure that is overwhelmed by kind of technogenesis, to use Bernard Stiegler's word, of the computer technology, of the moment of computer technology. I also wanted to just make just a footnote for your interest. There is a massive debate that unfolded here in South Africa about 10 years ago around a project to digitize the liberation struggle archives. And it's somewhat biographical, and it's a trauma that I'm still trying to recover from, as I was part of the project. And I might have been responsible for scuppering the project, for putting a span in the works. But it was an attempt to digitize the entire liberation struggle archives, and then ended up becoming a digitization project of the whole, the struggle of Southern Africa. And what was quite clear is the way in which it wanted to return us to the precedents of nationalist narration as the foundational principles for which the digital operated. And then just one last thing. I wonder if you could say something about immaterial labor. Because, Hart and Negri and others have argued that the communism of the machine is the new frontier of our struggle. And where, I want to hear what your kind of, if you have any investments in that argument, or any interest in the way Hart and Negri have produced.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I really, really liked it quite a bit, because I've been thinking about, similar questions, just for the sake of thinking, I guess, and also for the sake of experiencing life in this moment, right? So what I want to think through, essentially, I want to think through the archive, and then I want to think through democratization. And then I want to also really touch on, algorithms and, the social realities that we create on the internet, right? Is everything okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, and the reason why I'm thinking about this, have you ever heard the phrase, the internet doesn't forget? It's, it's like a phrase that I use, or that we use among, that I use among my friends when we're talking about the things that we're posting on the internet and the kind of lifespan that those things have, right? Because even if you decide you put something up and somebody takes it off, somebody might have screenshot it or kept it in some kind of archive that exists, in the world somehow. So, and as I'm thinking about that and thinking through democratization, I'm thinking about how we set up these communities for ourselves on the internet, right? These social realities that we're existing in. As you did say, you go on Facebook and then you engage with the things that you like. That's the kind of thing that is happening. So in that sense, what that is giving me is that in the way that I'm engaging with my communities on the internet, and I'm thinking, okay, that these are good ideas that I'm engaging on. These are ethical things that I'm engaging on. And then there's somebody like maybe Donald Trump who is engaging in the way that they're engaging with the internet, which is, what it is. So then I'm thinking about that and the fact that the internet doesn't exist, and I'm thinking about the archive, right? So what then exists in my mind is that the internet, the way that it exists, what comes about is that there's a good archive and then there's a bad archive. So all of these things, they exist and they will exist for a long time on the internet. So I was just wondering, if maybe you've thought about that, and if you have, how do we think through that, or how do we think into the next step? How do we come to a good place in terms, because this is so much to filter through, to decipher, and they all have lifespan. They have a long lifespan. So what do we how do we think through that? How do we think through the good and the bad archive that is existing today? But yeah.
Yeah, similarly, that was an incredible presentation, and it's got me thinking about all kinds of things that I'm struggling with. Your presentation worked in a visual register, and it's dealing with the interface. And I wondered if you thought about this problem that I guess in my wanderings through the digital, I come across this concept of the semantic web. And the idea that it is the web that is now engaged with readability for humans and machines and enables the turn towards data. It's something that I'm thinking about in terms of archive, because in the realm of the digital now, the digital is a couple of decades old already, but what's new is the semantic web, is the idea that it is now the notion of mind put to work in the archive. So in the internet, in the web, so the web is the equivalent of sometimes a human mind and sometimes machine mind, and the intertwinedness of it. So, I mean, I won't talk about the specifics of the digital in relation to archive, except that it raises a problematic of what we mean when we talk about preservation in this context, because preservation now means something very different. And in fact, it provides an opportunity. I just I don't know why. Okay, so it provides an opportunity to think anew, and I mean, just responding to what Parmesh is saying. Sorry, I'm talking long. I should be shorter. So instead of the provocation to limit or to arrest the dangers that are inherent in some of these formulations, what would be a way to think with the problem of I guess the limitations that it proposes, especially for the humanities. One of the things I'm thinking about, and I'll stop here, is how to think about this move towards datification as a disciplinary problem inside the humanities alongside the text, what we understand by the text. So maybe I'll park it there. And
I was watching yesterday's presentation by Moritz, it came to my mind too. This idea of, he mentioned about the tweet culture of just getting all these fragments and like such a speedy demand for production, for academic production. You get these fragments and you need to recycle in such a speedy way that so it does have, I think it does have a relation with how is it that these machines or these interfaces are teaching our sensorium more, of course, than what we realize, in the way that when we are actually thinking that we are producing academic knowledge or any kind of knowledge, we sort of forget that we are already in this flow, in this state of mind that's relating to the question that you asked about fear. Would be like a connection between fear and speed. Like, how is it that the promotion of fear has also to do with the fact that we have to be always in speed? So in a way, it's almost like slowing down puts you in a position of fear that you are going to be run over, that you're going to become quickly obsolete, if you want to use the term of technology that is so common and for so many people, especially older people. How is it that all these people feel that they're becoming obsolete? I think I'm sort of making a deviation from what you asked here. It came to my mind, this connection between fear and speed. And I wonder if the slowness in reading also is not conditioned by this state that if I slow down, I may be losing something, or somebody's going to go ahead and get in front of me, something. So slowing means losing, you know. So this is, and I can see this my effort because I am a designer, and I do design these things, you know. So it comes from practice too. So what I try to do theoretically is to slow down these machines, to look at them. That's why I went through this historical paths from the papers on the wall all the way to the infinite scroll. It's just to, as almost like a political position, as re-walking through this path. I cannot let this become erased or forgotten. that, you know, once there were hyperlinks, once people loved hyperlinks, and they could imagine this as a sort of a fragmentation with a positive view. So I think that if we sort of read the history of the interface slowly, we can politically oppose to this ever increasing speed. This is how I can address the things that you asked. But I think we would have to think of what does it mean in terms of the reading of a book? How does it affect the reading of paper, printed material? Yeah, because I know from my own practice at school that you know, students, people don't like to read whole books, and once I did propose for a graduate class, so let's read only one book, 12 pages per week. While I was in Princeton, people had to read 400 pages, and they had to watch movies. And many of the students, they push the first 4 like 3 times the speed of viewing a movie for a media class, for instance, because for them they had to finish and to consume and to see that movie and ignoring the temporality of the movie. It's almost like some kind of content, sort of completely smashing any formal engagement that you might have with temporality. I think I got a little bit dispersed here. The question. Now, the references that you said, they are not known to me, most of them. Really, yes, but so I'll try to do my best with the concepts that you rose. That was very interesting, the puppet as an antidote. And I mean, I just have to think about this. What is it that it's in a puppet that can be an antidote to us as puppets? It's like, how is it that the action of actually manipulating might open up a kind of practice that in a way embeds symbolically the power of the manipulation of things? You know, I don't know if that has anything to do with what you're from, but it's just, you know, the first associations I get from this question is, you know, puppeteering is obviously an image of power and an image of, you know, ventriloquizing the people. So when we assume that role symbolically, it may very well be a model of, you know, how is it that we can puppeteer these virtualizations machines? How could we try to turn this around? And then I think I'm going to mix a little bit with the questions. I'll go back specifically to your question in the end, but which is this idea of control, because we have had in doing a massive revolt, popular uprising in Brazil in 2013, there was something called, I think it's even international, called Media Ninja, which were people who went to the streets with their cell phones, and they started broadcasting live all the movements and people in the streets fighting. I guess there were many things in the agenda of fighting, but that was, of course, an appropriation of the technology in a very inventive way, and also establishing networks. It's not just the phone, the machine, but it was an understanding of the dispositive, of that this is not just this thing. This is connected to practices of the body. So when we see these interfaces like Facebook, we have to remember that these people are, how is it that ergonomically this thing is consumed? We, from computer era, are used to think that this is consumed sitting in front of a computer, but young people assume them on the move. So how is it that this can explore this on the move of things with these models, technological models that work to keep you still? But so how is it that you compare stillness with movement? And how is it that by moving and consuming all these things, we can maybe think of things like Media Ninja that go and also try to make an antidote to all this gloomy scenario that I presented. I was very pessimistic. But what I try to do, and now I'm sort of mixing up all the questions. But the thing is, what I think of that I do when I research these things is to behave, to empower the vernacular approach to technology, to empower naivety. It's like, I don't need to know about the algorithm. I don't need to know about the black box, because this is part of the power discourse. You cannot speak if you don't know about electronics, about how exactly those little things work. You don't know any of that, so you have no voice in here. So what I'm advocating to is something that other people do, which is actually we can, if we look at the surface, if we look at how the discourse circulates around these things, the visible points of icebergs. If we look at them, this may be an antidote for the discursive power that says, you know nothing about this, this is too complicated, don't even get close to it. That is always, especially in the humanities. I remember now, there was a lecture by Derrida called No Apocalypse, Not Now. It was talking about the nuclear race. And he addresses specifically this problem. He says, who says that we that work with text, the textual matter of things, who entitles us to talk about technology? So in this sense, the antidote comes from a certain political position of not lowering your head because you are ignorant in so many ways before this kind of technology, and also I would have to say, before even the academic apparatus, or the academic structure that also sometimes says you're not entitled to say. So what I do is just say, look at these things, and as I said, in a very simple way, I try to ask these questions. So when I try to use Derrida, is actually to go much like he does in the very detail of his text, and try to extract something from that and relate immediately to something that I can see more visibly in the surface of the interfaces. This is, I mean, addressing this point of antidote. Then you also, the human use of human beings. This is all. Thank you for all these references for me to go further on, because actually what I was really caught by was this thing about an analogy. Because, of course, Freud's topology has also been, as Derrida says, archived. It has also been naturalized. So when we say the PCBT psychic functional, we also think this is something from nature. And it's not, it's a construct like any other one. And so we are like confronting constructs. And Freud was already doing that, but he was in the position of an intellectual who would never think that the technical object is anything more than an alibi for a model, for a representation. I never think, that's why I think they're so interesting, because he asks, does it affect, like Benjamin also did, does the urban scene also affect our sensorium and is historically determined and all that? So, it's sort of old, maybe old questions to new things in a way. So, yeah. So then you asked about the good. I think I like to think in terms of good archive and bad archive. Because the other discourse is that this is just part of a whole global thing, much larger than we think, that we can never say this is good, this is bad, because it's all part of the same big tragedy. And I think that also, saying that, for instance, Media Ninja was good, it produced actually a huge archive. And this thing that presented you is bad because it presents the functioning of archival desk drive, which is a subject I didn't address here. It has to do with Derrida's book, but that is, I would say that is bad. I mean, if you think that you are really getting, of course, everybody knows that addictive behaviors through these things, but maybe if we just stop and look exactly how does it do. If this becomes, so this is, it comes back to something that Mort said yesterday, which is maybe revealing an episteme. Maybe if you redo this story and you understand a little bit or make it visible, you can maybe reveal some other structure that is behind or below or above that we don't really perceive always. So it's a work to be done. This thing, it's like it's a political work to do, and it takes a lot of work. It's not just to develop a complete, finished explanation, historical account that is closed. It's much more like, you know, a making of theory, in my opinion. So now you asked about the preservation. Yes, the preservation of the archive when it becomes digitized. And you said you lived a drama about this. I was curious about what kind of drama is that. But I mean, but I was thinking, as you were saying, of course, not knowing what you're talking about is, so is it that now everything that is digitized, it's under the danger of becoming evil just because it's digitized? How is it that, as you very well mentioned, we can also trust that if there is an archive somewhere, it is at least possible to imagine, despite all the machines of erasure and rearrangement, the curatorship of the past, it is possible to believe that this can be this is findable somewhere. So, but it is hard. If you, I don't know, I'm talking about my own experience. So many times, all this whole thing came from this. I started trying to find things and I couldn't. And I started to realize these machines are not friendly with searching, even though it's like the big thing is search. Of course, it's curated search. It's all directed for you to find certain things first. So it's, I mean, the preservation is never dissociated from a curation, from a kind of, it's preserved, but it's preserved in certain mechanisms that will always present it to you, not freely. Like, this is why I think that Derrida's evocations of the Greeks and the house is so interesting, because we don't know this house. We don't have this geological imagination. And that's why I think this. And also, how is it that you can think of preservation within the flow? Because we have an idea that the old archive is the idea of the preservation that stays there. But how is it that you think that preservation is to preserve something that is in movement? All these data, they're not like always here, always there, in the container, in the Silicon Valley. They're always in the move, on the move. So this brings this question of preserving something that is different than preserving that document, that painting, that has like a certain time and space coordinates. How do you preserve things, something that you actually, but I don't know the answer, of course. But your question about the semantic web, unfortunately, I think it's super fascinating, because also my other research is about post. It's about this transition of this word, of this shift in the usage of the word post, coming from, you know, letter, which had this meaning, and gradually disappearing with this idea. And so the semantic web, we can trace some historical lines, for instance, with 16th century letter writing manuals, which was already some kind of formulaic writing. So it's like how we can compare these models and extract something from while you were typing something in and the rest of the sentence comes. How is it different from all the models of writing that existed in the past, like writing itself as a model?
Yes. Ross says this was fascinating. Thank you. In the start of your presentation, you raised the connection to the post sent to mail. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the discontinuity with the relay system and the continuous scroll. What remains of the disciplinary system of the mail and the scroll? I'm interested specifically in the registration of mail and other forms of registration, including population registration and the registration of property, including the registration of slaves. Registration certainly continues today. We registered to join the online session today. How does registration connect to the post with today? On another note, I'm not sure technology is always an analogy for Freud. He says his microphone doesn't work, that's why he can't speak the question. Okay, cool.
Thanks so much for this fascinating paper. So if the infinite scroll is sort of the curated, algorithmically curated sort of sequencing of a selection of information and the presentation of that in a linear, visualized manner, isn't the opposite of that then, or its antidote, the database, everything. And the problem is, of course, that databases are currently more controlled by big corporations, Cambridge Analytica and so on. But isn't the database, I'm thinking also of scholarship, for example, big early modern databases where everything, has been digitized and is now available to Renaissance scholars. In a sense, a way out of the infinite scroll and its carefully sequenced linear presentation of information. So the database allows access to everything, so potentially democratizing a source of information.
Very quickly, I'm interested in the frame of infinite scroll. I'm interested in the punctuation of attention, and the mechanisms through which obviously big media try to get us to engage with them. But I'm thinking more in terms of, you made an analogy, and I know Ross is anxious about it, but the transference with the screen. And I wonder whether or not, so if something, a company like Facebook wants to, in a sense, regulate the punctuation of attention, they want to commodify our attention. Whether there's a possibility, rather than an antidote, a possibility of a non-regulated attention, if that makes sense. In a way, the unconscious arrival.
Herman, although isn't this exactly the opposite? Because of course you have all these ancient documents spread all over the internet, and you have this access. Yes, I think this is what is like the basis and what we would want it to be. All this availability of information. I think you're right to say that of course we have access to things that we never have. We do that in our very daily life. And this is, of course, a good thing. I would, however, thinking back with the tweet culture, immediacy with which you are, but this is a new thing, has nothing to do with infinite, but the immediacy with which you have access of information, just like that, this which relates to what you said. It doesn't have also to do with this super acceleration of one having his wishes satisfied immediately. And so all these machines, the very structure that it shows with the building blocks. It is meant to have to provide you with satisfaction without you even having to ask. So I wonder if, even though it's, yes, more democratic and the availability of the database, you can think of that abstractly. I'm thinking in the phenomenal dimension of it. If it is actually that good that we have everything instantly, I mean, I'm just displacing a little bit of your question, but I do think about that. You know, this man Asa Haskin, who invented the infinite scroll. The metaphor he uses is like, you have a bowl of soup. You drink the soup, I put another bowl of soup under it. I put another bowl of soup. So this ever-ready resource for anything you have, in a way, can be, yes, it's so marvelous that we can have information so speedy, but I wonder if we cannot connect that to the tweeting culture also. Because if everything is so easily achieved, which I'm not denying, I'm a user of this. I'm actually, you know that user interface, there's one guy, a designer, who said, there's just one field in design, there are just two fields that employs the word user. That is interactive design and drug dealers. User. So, I'm always thinking about it. And sorry, I'm again escaping your questions. I think what I myself.
You can stop whenever you want.
No, the thing about punctuation of attention, I was very, and the commodification of attention, I thought this was very, very interesting because, of course, you know, even these people who worked in social media and was ex-employees of Google, they just came out a year ago with this film called The Social Dilemma. It's a very commercial film, but they come to public and they say, they actually formulate this, that what's been sold by these companies is not your data, it profiles your preferences. They're not selling this. They're selling their ability to shape it, to shape, you know, your attention span. So this is actually very much part of an intentional endeavor of all these interfaces. While I was doing this research, I was very shocked. Maybe it's not to most people now, but I was very shocked to know that there were companies selling the information of how long your cursor of your mouse stays over a certain link, how long you are, you know, waiting to click. So this is a commodification of this time of your attention, because while you're there, are you like suspended, right? And of course, we could connect this to Jonathan Crowley's very interesting book, Suspensions of Attention. He says that right in industrialization times, attention became, since then, commodified. Since then, it was understood that full attention was not very productive. So there was also a will of commodifying the lack of attention. So if this comes from, you know, industrialization, who would know what happens today? I'm sorry if I think I...
No. Thank you so much.